It was 1962, the height of the Cold War, a moment when unrelenting anxiety about the future was leavened by an abiding faith in the power of science to secure our safety and prosperity. Then came an incendiary book that sowed seeds of doubt.
This is one of the nation's best sellers, first printed on September 27, 1962. Up to now, 500,000 copies have been sold, and Silent Spring has been called the most controversial book of the year.
At the eye of the storm was Rachel Carson, one of the most celebrated American writers of her time. With her first 3 books, a lyrical trilogy about the sea, Carson had opened people's eyes to the natural world. Now, in Silent Spring, she delivered the dark warning that they might soon destroy it.
If we are ever to solve the basic problem of environmental contamination, we must begin to count the many hidden costs of what we are doing.
Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
It was sort of the gospel at the time that human ingenuity would triumph over nature. What Carson was arguing was for caution. She really confronted the orthodoxies of her time.
She was accused of being a communist, of being a hysterical female Luddite. The reaction was to attack the messenger.
Carson was an unlikely heretic, dutiful, demure, and so jealous of her solitude that her most intimate relationship was conducted mainly through letters. She'd thrust herself into the public eye, all the while harboring a secret that was literally killing her. To some, Silent Spring was an act of heroism. To others, an irresponsible breach of scientific objectivity. But there could be no dispute that with her rebuke to modern technological science, Carson had shattered a paradigm.
Rachel Carson not only changed the kind of questions we ask about the environment, I think she caused us to start to ask those questions. She's the instigator.
Hello, and welcome to the program. That was a clip on a documentary about Rachel Carson, and she will be the topic of our discussion today. But first, let me welcome the panelists. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So Rachel Carson was a marine biologist and conservationist. Her writings caught the public's attention with its wonderment and beauty about the natural world. She also warned of the dangers when humankind uses poisons and pesticides in an ecosystem. Her landmark book, Silent Spring, raised the alarm about the use of DDT and its damaging effects on wildlife and the environment. In fact, her work was a catalyst for the environmental movement that came about in the late 1960s after her death. She made a lasting impression, and she will be the topic of our discussion today. We will watch several clips from the documentary on PBS about her American experience, and we'll discuss. But first, let me just go around and get everyone's sort of initial thoughts on Rachel and what you thought about her. Mike, let's start with you. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think Rachel, as far as her writing ability, obviously a fantastic writer, and the fact she was able to use that to communicate the fact that nature is something we shouldn't take for granted. And then obviously when she got into the DDT thing in her research and her stories about that, it was just amazing. You think about the way she communicated in a way that really hit people when that book came out.
Yeah.
And I'm sure when she first started writing about nature, she never thought she would be writing about such a catastrophic chemical like that. Probably wasn't in her plan. She just wanted to be a writer. But it's amazing she reached that point in her life. She had the courage to actually write something like that, because obviously there's going to be a lot of pushback from big business, the government, on something like that. But she just had the fortitude to, just plow ahead on it, even though there were other issues she had to deal with as a person. So,
right. Yeah, good stuff. Karen, what are your thoughts?
Definitely. That just amazing too how, with her being a writer and setting out to be a writer, going to college to get into English and writing, and then taking that turn, like sort of listening to her instincts, like, wow, this ocean's kind of cool. Look at these creatures. Maybe I should try something else. And then the fact that she was open to that, and then open to so much as she explored nature and did her scuba diving, and then realized with the DDT how, wait a minute, things are kind of coming together here, that it's really bad for the things I love in nature, but recognizing that she had to table that for a while, but then having that courage when that really came to the forefront, the DDT, to just go full on in and say, this is what I have to do, no matter what the consequences are of my personal relationships or to me. So,
right.
Yeah.
Holly?
Well, I agree with you both. I think she was amazing in her own way. The fact that she wrote and had something published when she was 10. The fact that she was able to go to college and study and move from writing to biology, and she did all these wonderful things, but when it came to her passion and with the DDT and pesticides, and she used her voice in a different way. So, I mean, she was so against the fact that pesticides were being used, but they weren't tested, so they didn't know what the outcome was going to be later on. They were just looking at it, at that moment.
Right.
But, she was persistent, and I think that we all can take something like that from her. It was her persistence over the course of so many years of trying to get people to listen to her. She wasn't trying to abandon all use of pesticides, but she was trying to awaken people's minds, this is what could happen if we continue to use it the way that we are. And she used her writing and her knowledge, and I think she just found an avenue to get through to people, and I think it was great how she did it.
Nice, yeah. I find it interesting how she's able to read all these scientific journals and the material, and she's able to synthesize it in a way to make it for the public to understand. Almost sort of like what Carl Sagan did with astronomy in the 1970s and the 1980s. There's a lot of information here, but how does the public want to hear this? And she presented, she had wonderful writing with her description, as I mentioned, with the beauty and wonderment of the world. Another thing that really impressed me about her was she sacrificed, she helped her family during the Depression. Yep. She was the only breadwinner in the family. Yeah. And as we will see, when other things happened with her extended family, she took on that responsibility. And sometimes she thought, well, there goes the end of my writing career because I have to take care of my family. Yep. So she was quite an individual on a personal level as well. So let's take a look at our next clip. This will be about her childhood up to her young adult years, and then we'll see how she grew up. Let's take a look.
She was the solitary sort of girl who greeted the birds on the way to school in the morning and was partial to the companionship of books. At the age of 8, she was writing stories of her own. At 10, at her mother's urging, Rachel entered a contest sponsored by the popular children's magazine St. Nicholas and became a published author. By 14, she was submitting her work to magazines for sale.
If we picture a girl in a small farm in nowhere, Pennsylvania, who is transported through literature and can imagine being elsewhere, I think she was led to see that as something that she could do, and it was constantly reinforced.
Rachel Carson had always wanted to go to college and couldn't. So she was going to be quite sure that this daughter, this smart daughter, was going to go to college.
When Rachel won a scholarship to Pennsylvania College for Women, Maria sold off even the family china to help cover her daughter's expenses, then made the 30-mile round trip to Pittsburgh most weekends to visit her.
She was the star pupil. Everyone realized right away what a talented writer she was, and also saw that this was her ambition in life, that she wanted to be a writer. So it came as a great shock when she fell in love with biology. The science of life just struck a chord in her that I think she didn't realize was there.
Thrilled by the prospect of understanding the natural world she'd been taught to so closely observe, Carson changed her major from English to biology and announced her intention to go on to graduate school. She spent the next 2 years taking courses in zoology, physiology, anatomy. But her true interest only revealed itself after graduation, when she landed a coveted research spot at the Marine Biology Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and for the first time in her life, laid eyes on the ocean.
She's moved beyond just the ordinary person would be moved who would have seen the ocean for the first time. The sea taught her everything that she later came to want to understand and want the world to understand. That everything was connected to everything else.
Had it not been for the Depression and her family's dire financial straits, Carson might have become a marine biologist. As it was, she'd barely started her graduate work at Johns Hopkins before her parents, her older sister, and her 2 nieces came to live with her in Baltimore. Full-time study gave way to part-time study and part-time work. Then, when Carson was 28, her father died suddenly. Not long after, her sister died as well, leaving 2 daughters in Rachel and her mother's care. Now the family's sole breadwinner, Carson left Johns Hopkins with her master's degree and took a job with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, writing an assortment of publications about the Bureau's marine conservation work.
As she's looking over at the press releases she's writing, she realizes that some of these subjects are kind of interesting and could be turned into feature stories for a local newspaper. So she starts selling stories to the Baltimore Sun that are based on some of the work that she's seeing being done at the Bureau of Fisheries.
From time to time, Carson omitted her first name from her signature, believing certain pieces would have more credibility if they were presumed to have been written by a man. Still, as she later said, it was a turning point. I had given up writing forever, I thought. It never occurred to me that I was merely getting something to write about.
She has at last found this way to combine her 2 passions in life. Biology and writing merge, and I think really from that time forward, she never thinks of them as being separate things. What she is someone who writes about science.
Okay, well, there we go. It's interesting how I think this happens to quite a few people. You go to college and you with one subject or major in mind that you're going to do, but then you are pulled somewhere else. It's interesting how, though, later she's able to merge the 2.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that clip?
Well, I mean, her joy for writing, again, that seems to be the catalyst of her life going forward, from a child on. But to get into that, the fish and wildlife job, I think that gave her more opportunities to see more things, have more ideas about writing. And it's interesting how even today, the discrimination sometimes with authors, where she used the first 2 initials of her name because she felt maybe if it's written by a woman, it's going to be less taken in by the public. J.K. Rowling did the same thing with Harry Potter. She used their first 2 initials, and so I think there is still some stigmas or some discrimination that goes on in a lot of things, and that's one of them with writers and women. It's just that things have not gone 100% the other way. So that is interesting. But the way that she had those challenges throughout her life, with her mother getting sick, she had to adopt one of her nephews. She had so many challenges in her life in general. To be able to continue her career and continue to write, it's really you really admire her for being able to do that. So.
Yeah. I was thinking about her mom selling off the family china.
Oh yeah.
So she could go to
serious. I mean, because how many kids or how many family members were still in the house when she went to college?
Yeah.
So if they're selling everything off for her to get her education, that must have left the family pretty strapped, knowing they already were.
Right.
And then put them in a whole nother situation. So, I mean, they, must have figured she was going big places.
I read outside of the documentary that we're watching that she did get a scholarship to that college,
Okay.
but it wasn't enough. It's expensive. And her mom always had wanted to go to college. Apparently she had older siblings, and so they really weren't in the picture. And so she was her mother's child, is what I got. And she was like, gosh darn it, this one's going to college. And
Yeah, she certainly wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth like some people. So, I mean, the challenges that she had were tough to overcome for some people, but she was able to do that. So
yeah,
definitely, and that time too. It's not like 10 years ago or something like that. That must have been even more challenging. Around the Depression and being a woman wanting to get into marine biology, being a writer. Being accepted to go to Woods Hole on this prestigious boat project, if you will. The thing that really strikes me is, because I'm actually someone who I've always loved nature. And when they talk about her talking to the birds in the morning, that's just, I
it sounds
do
like
that
you.
all the time. So that really resonated with me. And then also, just the idea of her seeing the ocean for the first time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you
thought
all
of that.
grew up around here, right? We're all
Right.
ocean
It
raised
doesn't
and-
strike me like it's always been there, but for someone who hasn't.
Right, and then someone who has this profound connection with nature to see the ocean and recognize.
It's got to be amazing, though.
Yeah, really. Really something.
Wow. All right. Well, our next clip is going to talk about her when her writing career starts to bloom and where it takes her. So let's take a look.
In 1937, a piece Carson published in The Atlantic came to the attention of Simon & Schuster, which offered her a small advance for a book about the sea. Hopeful the opportunity would help her make the leap to full-time writer, she poured 3 years' worth of nights and weekends into the book, a kind of literary triptych about the lives of 3 sea creatures. Under the Sea Wind earned early critical praise, but the rush to the bookstore Carson had dreamed of never happened.
A few weeks after the book is released, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and everybody's attention shifts from books. And Under the Sea Wind just kind of vanishes without a trace, never sells even 2,000 copies.
For Carson, there would be no escape from her day job. By the time the war came to an end in 1945, she was back to pitching feature stories and frustrated beyond measure. What she was, as a friend put it, was a would-be writer who could not afford the time for creative work.
I don't think Rachel sees that there's much alternative. She's got a good job, she's got family to support, so she's really stuck.
On an overcast morning in July 1949, Rachel Carson found herself in a boat off the coast of Miami, staring down into the storm-churned waters of Biscayne Bay. After 5 years spent making the best of her job at the Fish and Wildlife Service, she'd begun to toy with the idea of writing another book about the sea. And this time, she was determined to experience her subject firsthand. But now on the boat, the prospect of simply getting into the water seemed impossibly daunting. The diving helmet alone weighed 84 pounds. Carson, at 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed all of 120. She managed to descend about 8 feet to the bottom of the boat's ladder, staying just long enough to note the presence of seaweed and a few vibrantly colored fish. She never once let go of the ladder's rung.
Carson wanted to be the biographer of the ocean. She wanted certainly to tell about its beauty and about how intricate nature was. She had access to confidential information. She had access to submarine research. She was a master synthesizer. She could take information from this place and that place and then see how it went together.
Carson's technique was to identify the leading experts in the field, ask a few harmless questions about their work, and then once she got her foot in the door with them, to expand the questionings.
In the evenings, after a full day at the office and dinner with her mother, Carson cloistered herself in her study and worked on her book, sometimes until dawn.
Once you have all these hundreds and hundreds of papers, you need to shape them in some kind of narrative. And that requires a very different prose style than what she was reading. And so when you go about taking that material and transforming it, but still being true to it, it's just an extraordinarily difficult thing.
The whole world ocean extends over about 3/4 of the surface of the globe. If we subtract the shallow areas of the continental shelves and the scattered banks and shoals, or at least the pale ghost of sunlight moves over the underlying bottom, there still remains about half the earth that is covered by miles-deep, lightless water that has been dark since the world began.
Drawing upon all that was then known about the ocean, Carson told the story of its life over the eons and revealed a natural realm largely indifferent to the rhythms of man. The Sea Around Us reached #1 on the bestseller list. There it would remain for an astonishing 32 weeks. When it at last dropped a notch, it was joined on the list by a reissue of Carson's first book, in what the New York Times called a publishing phenomenon as rare as a total solar eclipse. At 44, Rachel Carson, the one-time would-be writer, had 2 of the country's nonfiction bestsellers.
Okay. Wow, perseverance. She thought,
for sure.
She writes one book, the war starts. I think they said there was only sold 2,000 copies.
Yes.
That's going to be really disappointing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And she kept with it, and it's just amazing that she also ended up with 2 books on the bestsellers list. And as I mentioned before, I'm just so intrigued by the way that she, like that person was saying, how she synthesizes information. Like she's seeing things from submarine charts and then with her own eyes, being under the water, and is able to bring that all together in a way that you all mentioned that people can understand. Like she has a way of writing that would be similar to Carl Sagan.
Right. Just draws you in, yeah.
And you can just also feel, like seeing pictures of her on the boat and looking out, you can just feel the passion that she has for this subject, and it's inspirational for whatever anyone is into. To be like, yeah, I'm just gonna go for this. Learn everything I can about it, and if you're able to write about it, even better. And share that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed with that, because especially if you look at today's day and age, I mean, it's just so many distractions in life, and to be that dedicated to your writing books, or writing about a specific subject, it really takes a lot of dedication and perseverance to do that. It's not an easy task.
Yeah,
dedication.
She would do a full day's work, come home, tend to her mother, and then be up.
Right, all night.
All night.
That takes,
and then get up in the morning and go back to your job.
But that's what you do if you really think you have something.
I think it's amazing too, because, especially with her style of writing, at that time, there was so many things going on. There was like a lot of, between wartime and depression and poverty and, all these things going on, but she's writing about love. Like, what I'm saying, within, what's in the water or nature, or, she's writing about all these beautiful things that don't have anything to do with what's weighing heavy on people's minds. Yeah, and it's almost like this refreshing notion or this refreshing read that people can just kind of like let everything go and be like, wow, this is really beautiful. Yeah. So it's just a different perspective than what people are living day to day, and I think it was maybe what people needed at that time. So
that's a good point. It's an escape, but it's an escape to the real world.
Yeah.
I mean, we have our problems and we're
But
fighting.
not everybody's looking at that real world either. So sometimes people need that reminder, like this is still here.
Yeah.
Like maybe this stuff that's not going so great is around, but we still have all this. Like we can't forget about all this. So
yeah, I
think she was just looking at it in a different perspective than other people, and I just think it was wonderful. It was really nice.
And plus, I think the ocean. I remember when I was a kid. I think it was Jacques Cousteau had come out with television, with videos. And it's like at that time, I remember he was very popular because you're talking about the ocean and the seas. And I don't think really people had really researched that as much as they have today. And it was kind of amazing. People were just kind of like, wow, because there hadn't been much coverage of the sea itself. And that is an escape from the real world. Yeah. That's the real world. But the world we have out here, where those problems aren't in the sea, those are completely different. That's nature. So it was a good escape, I think. You're right. Yeah.
And it's very important to popularize science, as we will see, because it does affect our lives, and we should have some general knowledge of it, at least as a public, as laymen.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah.
One thing I was really impressed about her is she seems to have a way. She's a small person, and she seems very like a gentle person, but she goes to these experts. And she has a way of just sort of asking questions here and then digging a little deeper. And I bet her personality just sort of was the right approach to get people to give her this information that she would put together and synthesize. And
she's clever, very.
Yeah. Well, let's watch our next clip. This is a little bit about her personal life, and it's quite interesting. So we'll talk about it. Let's take a look.
When the demands of promoting the sea around us threatened to overwhelm her, Carson escaped to Maine, to a remote stretch of the Central Coast where slivers of land reach out into the ocean and the tides rise higher than anywhere along the Atlantic seaboard. Now, flush from the sales of 2 best-selling books, she purchased a plot on Southport Island and built a summer cottage of her own.
Rachel wanted to be still, to feel and to imagine, and this was the place that would allow her to do that.
Before her house was even habitable, Carson received a letter from a Mrs. Dorothy Freeman, whose family owned a cottage a half-mile up the shoreline from Carson's property. Dorothy's husband, Stanley, had been given a copy of The Sea Around Us for his birthday.
My grandparents had read it out loud to each other, sailing or on the porch of their cottage, and had adored it. It really spoke to a lot of what they cared about in life.
Having finally resigned her position at the Fish and Wildlife Service to dedicate herself to writing, Carson lacked even the companionship of colleagues. The friendship that bloomed with the Freemans was a revelation to her. The couple shared her love for nature and the sea, and enthusiastically joined in her tide pool explorations. Dorothy marveling at the unseen life that teemed at the shoreline, while Stanley took photographs.
Dorothy Freeman and Rachel Carson had almost from the beginning this deep, deep emotional connection.
Dorothy was 55, the mother of a grown son, a new grandmother, a devoted homemaker and wife. Now, as the summer turned to fall and Southport was abandoned for the season, she became the confidant that Carson, at 46, had never had. In early January 1957, her niece Marjorie contracted a pneumonia so severe she had to be hospitalized. 2 weeks later, Margie was dead, and her 5-year-old son Roger became Carson's responsibility.
Rachel kind of had a hard life that way. You know, first she had to raise my mother and my mother's sister because their parents died when they were very young. And then the same thing repeated itself just when she was getting out from under it. She was very considerate of my feelings all the time, sometimes to the detriment of her own work.
In the spring, on the heels of her 50th birthday, Carson legally became Roger's adoptive mother and tried to resign herself to her changed circumstances. She was all but convinced she'd never again have the time to write. Then, friends told her about a U.S. Department of Agriculture program to eradicate the fire ant. And more than a decade after she'd proposed the piece about DDT to Reader's Digest, pesticides came roaring back into her consciousness. World War II had raised the profile of American science. Now, the Cold War made it soar.
The atom was used in a very destructive way, but it also suggested in many ways that science was at the forefront of something grand. This is the way in which we will solve the problems of the world.
The laboratory was no longer merely the source of the nation's military might. It was also, ever increasingly, a font of ingenious chemical tools that gave mankind an edge against its enemies in the natural world.
For any sort of question that deals with nature, what is emerging in the post-war period is that chemicals will solve the problem. So if your question is about crop production, more chemicals. If your question is about public health, more chemicals. If your question is about how do I protect my home from these unwanted pests, more chemicals.
People are worshiping at the altar of science and technology because finally it's making us the human masters of the planet. And we're taking this incredibly dangerous, unnurturing landscape, and it is now under our control. Science is rewriting the way we live on Earth. And so there was very little questioning.
Rachel Carson was less sure. To her, there seemed something dangerous about a world in which human ingenuity knew no limits.
Oh. Wow. So let's hit on the relationship with the Freemans. I think that's really interesting because she's not married, Rachel. She has no children of her own, and she meets this other couple, and then she really connects with Dorothy. And it seems like she has a confidant, you know? It's like this is a really close bond. And it's interesting how life will just, there's a lot of non-traditional ways to have closeness with somebody. And I don't know, what do you guys thought about that? What do you think?
It is really interesting, especially that late in life. The documentary almost gives the impression that she never had any friends at all, right? That she only had responsibility in writing and work, and you know, her family. They talk about it almost like her family. It's just another responsibility, even though there was obviously closeness, like her mother encouraging her to go to college. Yeah. And the way that Roger seems to speak fondly of her as well. But they also had talked about in the documentary her just how solitary she was, which is often the writer's fate, right? Someone who's like, especially a prolific writer, you're usually doing that just all alone. And then nature is such a nourishing environment for that, because you can be alone, but you're actually not, because nature is all around. You're in the ocean, and so many things in the ocean. Along the coast where she was staying, all of the different creatures in the tidal pool. And then to happen upon this couple and to have that kindred spirit with Dorothy, of someone who also sees the world in the same way. It's really inspiring.
And maybe for her, maybe it happened at just the right time.
Right, exactly.
Because she had given up her job and moved, and basically everyone in her family, except for her now adopted son, had passed away.
Right.
So she had family that was living with her prior, and I don't know how close they were, but there were still people around her, but now everyone's passed.
Right.
She's moved, and she's lost, you know, she left her job. So maybe that was the perfect point for her now to have, in whatever capacity they met, but they were supposed to meet maybe like at that time, and it was a perfect time for her. So
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that human connection that she had with that friend probably helped her. Again, I mean, and it's tough to read what's going on, but I mean, let's face it, there's people today who you don't have a lot of friends, you don't have a lot of relatives, and maybe she didn't have an outlet like today you can go see a psychologist or something. So maybe that helped her, you know, it helped her in just life in general, and then to have that confidant as far as writing. A good friend is important. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
You got to think all the burdens she's taken on with her family, that's the world that when she's not writing, she's stuck in.
Yes.
And that finally somebody comes along and it's her friend, you know, and she can talk to her and kind of leave the responsibilities about family and this and that to the side for a moment and just, you know, you have a friendship going on there.
and the fact that most of their relationship was through letters.
Yeah,
Very,
that was brought up, yeah.
Very, very few actual interactions, but throughout the course of years, all through letters back and forth is actually pretty amazing then, so.
Yeah.
That's right. In the full documentary, they had mentioned that they probably spent all of 60 hours
Yep.
Something like that.
Yep.
Which is
And
amazing.
the amount, I don't know if it was like 7 years or something like that, but I think the granddaughter was stating, but it was a pretty lengthy amount of time, and then considered the time that they actually spent together was like minute. It was very little. It was very little.
There's a lot of people used to write letters all the time. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But, but that's, you know, it's kind of a lost thing because you can really sit there and you can put your thoughts down and so forth. But you know, you know, now we just send a meme or an email.
Well, what's interesting about the connection she had with this woman, the letters. So in today's day and age, there's been stories about it, how people have become so lonely, especially the younger generation, where they're in their parents' basement and they're writing online, you know, conversing with, they think someone's online, it ends up being a bot.
Yeah.
So the human connection is like, but that's what's fulfilling their connection with, they think it's a person, it fulfills that need to have a friend, even though it's a robot. It's neat. So to see her get that connection, it was probably very important in her life in the long run. So.
And it sounds like it actually really influenced the writing of her book.
Yeah.
She mentioned in the full documentary that she was having trouble writing it to start, and then she pictured she was writing a letter to Dorothy, and then that's how it allowed the creativity to happen and the writing.
Roger, I'm glad they had him on the documentary. He seems like a nice person. I mean,
that's the adopted son.
The adopted son. You know, just taking that on. That's amazing. And the clip ends with the DDT, with what was going on in the world at the time with chemicals. Chemicals solve everything. I try to think about the United States comes out of World War II. Europe is still rebuilding. Japan is, they're still rebuilding. So the United States comes out and they're kind of like on top. And science and technology, that sort of 50s and 60s mentality, like they keep bringing up in this documentary. It's like, man, they say man, humankind, well, we can just control nature. We can control it to do what we want. We can come up with this. And, you know, you see that with the chemicals, and it's going to go into some of the bad effects of that. It can be very damaging. But that mindset of that time, and you still see a little bit of that today, actually probably quite a bit, but, well, we can control, and we can just have nature do our bidding, you know, in the way we want. I'm like, it doesn't really work that way. So.
Exactly.
But let's take a look at the next clip. This kind of gets into the pesticides and DDT, and see what you guys want to talk about afterwards. Okay. Here we go.
Diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. It was first synthesized back in the 19th century, and it sat on lab shelves for decades. Nobody knew if it did anything, if it had any useful purpose, until 1939, when a Swiss chemist named Paul Muller discovered that it was a very potent insecticide. It killed all kinds of bugs very readily.
Farmers have been doing war with insects and other pests for a long time, and they had been using what we think of now as almost obviously homicidal poisons to do that.
Biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service begin to see pretty quickly that when DDT is used in certain areas, there's evidence of problems. There's evidence of fish kill or bird kill. And they see that. And like any expert, they publish it in a place where other experts will read it. But how that information then filters out to a larger public is a very big question. And so what we see in the 1950s is tremendous amounts of money going into studying pest killing, not so much money going into studying broader questions of wildlife biology, broader questions of environmental health, broader questions of environmental toxicity.
The Department of Agriculture and the chemical industry say one of the reasons that we have such a rich material life is that we have found ways to control these problems to maximize food and fiber production.
In 1957, in the USDA's all-out war against the fire ant, some 20 million acres in the South were doused with pesticides, killing not only ants, but blackbirds and meadowlarks, armadillos and opossums. The sprayed areas, as one Alabama agricultural official reported, reeked with the odor of decaying wildlife. What concerned Carson was not merely that synthetic pesticides had unintended consequences, but that substances about which so little was known were now practically ubiquitous. Widely employed by government agencies to protect health and agriculture, as well as American interests abroad, synthetic pesticides also were sold directly to consumers, who by 1957 could choose from an array of some 6,000 different products. Although manufacturers were required by law to register new chemical compounds, the government mandated no independent safety testing of those compounds and placed no limitation on their sale or use.
The companies that are manufacturing DDT focus on this question of immediate short-term toxicity. They say, well, look, it's not toxic.
You had examples of people digesting spoonfuls of DDT just to prove how safe it was.
Oh, it's safe. Look, I didn't die.
At the same time, birds are dying en masse, fish are dying, and I think Rachel understood that something radically transformative was happening, in the sense that scientists have been asking the wrong question. Scientists have been thinking about the question of acute toxicity rather than what are the long-term impacts of this chemical world that we're creating.
For Carson, it began with research, a gathering of bits of information excavated from technical reports and obscure scientific journals. What soon became clear was that pesticides such as DDT accumulated in the organisms exposed to them and grew ever more concentrated as they moved up the food chain. According to one study, earthworms were still so toxic a full year after exposure to DDT that they poisoned the robins that fed upon them. Another demonstrated that when birds were fed a minuscule amount of DDT daily, both their fertility and the survival rate of their young dramatically declined. Most troubling of all was the evidence that insect populations very quickly developed resistance to synthetic pesticides.
You use more pesticides, insects become more resistant. More resistance, more pesticides, more resistance. And now you're trapped in an escalating cycle. And it's a damaging cycle because meanwhile you're also killing fish and birds and other things that you like and that you want.
In isolation, each study Carson read was little more than an anecdote. Taken together, they offered compelling evidence that synthetic pesticides had potentially grave disadvantages, none of which were yet fully understood. I realized that here was the material for a book, Carson later recalled. Everything which meant most to me as a naturalist was being threatened, and nothing I could do would be more important. In May 1958, she signed a contract with Houghton Mifflin for what her friend and editor Paul Brooks had dubbed the Poison Book.
Oh boy. It's crazy to see, like, I don't know, I don't think you'd see that today. Like, oh, just...
It was everywhere.
Spray. There was one shot, we didn't see that, but if you guys remember in the documentary, little kids are at a picnic table, and there's just like this, like, What's going on?
Moms
Just
would put in the
pesticide.
paper. It was like a DDT. It had on the paper that you would put on the bottom of the shelf.
It's like the shelf liner.
And you'd put food on it. You'd put food and tableware on it, so that way you wouldn't get any insects inside of your cupboards. And the mothers are just spraying it around the house as if it's perfume, and it was everywhere. It was just all over the place.
It's so strange too, because to think that anything you're being told as the public, I would think, especially back then when really media was just becoming a big thing, television, the war was over, everybody's like, all right, here we are, let's move to the suburbs and we'll be the nuclear family and live the,
this is what we're supposed to do,
and it's just so strange how people would automatically assume that anything released is good, right? Like you wouldn't even question it.
Right.
It's almost that faith in just the country in general, or the government, that the government would have the oversight. Like, boy, well, of course I can use this because nobody would ever put this out unless it were good for me to use. So it's really just brings to light how much we didn't back then know, and how much faith we had in those companies.
Also,
and they didn't know either.
Yeah, with the chemicals, I know that, I think it was in the documentary, one section where it said when they looked at these chemicals, when they produced them, a farmer would go to, or someone would go to the agency that was in the chemical company or the government was involved. They'd say, okay, I want this chemical produced to kill these bugs. And their test would be, yeah, it killed the bugs, and it didn't seem to kill the person who did, did the application, so I guess it's okay.
Right.
Little did we know that. But that's really the same with a lot of chemicals that are produced today. I mean, it's certainly more oversight, more testing done, but every drug you see on television has warnings about how this could kill you somehow, or it could end up with you with some disease. So it continues to go on, but on the whole, DDT was produced was sitting on a shelf. But it really became something that was helpful with the war because it killed all the mosquitoes and malaria. So it certainly had a good purpose, but then because it's a for-profit company producing that, DuPont, all of a sudden it becomes, you could use this on many other things. So I think profit was a big point in this whole production of this chemical that ended up being not good for anybody.
It's just crazy that nobody thought, well, we should regulate this.
Yes.
There should be some sort of testing and so forth. And, this comes back to, this is the importance of regulation.
Yes.
Because otherwise the wolves take over. And, it's perfectly fine. There's nothing to worry about.
It's true.
All right, well, I don't know if I want to trust you on that. But, I guess we had to begin somewhere. And, again, it's that mindset coming out of World War II. It's the greatest generation, and you just accepted what was told. Like, well, this has to be fine, and we slowly learned that, it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
That's why I think history is very important because, in this day and age where you're talking about government cutbacks, I mean, there's reasons for regulation to prevent stuff like this happening over and over again. So,
right. And it seems like we have to have, we forget about that we need it, and then we don't fund it, or we fire a bunch of people, and but then we wait for some other mishap and go, well, wait a minute, why didn't we have? Well, those people are now gone, and the money's gone for that. So it's like we keep having to just, I don't know. Anywho, so this gives Rachel her idea for her book that she, they called it the Poison Book, but it became Silent Spring, which we will watch a clip on now and discuss.
All right.
Let's take a look.
Initially, she'd thought it a nuisance. First, in early January 1960, a painful ulcer. Then a sinus infection that laid her low for weeks. Then 2 lumps in her left breast, discovered during an examination in March. Carson had a history of breast tumors, and twice had had them surgically removed. This time, one tumor was suspicious enough to require a radical mastectomy. According to the pathology report, the removed tumor had in fact been malignant, and it had metastasized to her lymph nodes.
The book became a race for her to finish.
In late January 1962, nearly 4 years after she'd begun to write it, Carson finally submitted the bulk of the manuscript to both Houghton Mifflin and The New Yorker. On June 16, 1962, as the elements of Silent Spring were being prepared for publication, the first New Yorker installment arrived on the newsstands, and with its opening paragraphs, lured readers into a fertile world of plenty.
There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms with fields of grain and hillsides of orchards, where in spring, white clouds of bloom drifted above the green fields.
In the zealous quest for mastery, Carson argued, synthetic pesticides had been used indiscriminately, excessively, heedlessly, upsetting the delicate balance of nature and putting all life at risk. The furor arose even before the second and third installments of Silent Spring hit the newsstands. The New Yorker was deluged with letters. So too was the USDA. Most of those who wrote, an agency spokesman told the New York Times, expressed horror and amazement that the use of such toxic chemicals was even permitted.
She raised the level of awareness of the general public of all of these chemical applications and why we need to think about their implications.
Scientists for the chemical industry in the USDA were incensed by Carson's assertions. To heed Carson's call for restraint, it was argued, meant nothing less than the end of all human progress. The Monsanto Company, an industry leader, papered news outlets across the country with a spoof of Silent Spring's opening chapter. By August, with the publication of the book still more than a month away, the controversy over Silent Spring had reached the nation's capital, and a special science advisory committee had been convened to review all federal policies on pesticides.
Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's book, but they are examining the matter.
When President Kennedy said, yeah, we're going to look into this, we're going to reach in to the private sector and see if we need to regulate these products in a different way, that was a threat. That's a threat to the bottom line. That's a threat to the business that these companies were in.
Inundated with interview requests, Carson agreed that fall to only 2 that involved cameras, a profile in Life magazine and an appearance on CBS Reports with Eric Sevareid. The 2-day interview session with CBS at her home in Silver Spring was so taxing that it became plain to Sevareid that Carson was ill. Get the piece on the air as soon as possible, he urged his producer. You've got a dead leading lady. In the end, Silent Spring flew off the shelves. Before long, it was a runaway bestseller. Then, on May 15th, came the long-awaited report from the President's Science Advisory Committee.
And they say, yes, there are some benefits to using pesticides, and no, we probably don't want to outlaw and ban all pesticides tomorrow, but there is substantial scientific evidence that the indiscriminate use of pesticides, the overuse of pesticides, and particularly certain persistent pesticides like DDT, may be problematic.
I think it's a splendid report, Carson told a journalist. I feel that the report has vindicated me and my principal contentions. There was for Carson one last summer at Southport, a summer filled with birdsong and the sound of the wind in the spruce trees. On April 14, 1964, Rachel Carson died. She was 56 years old.
Silent Spring was the book that changed the world. It taught us that life was fragile.
There are not very many people who you say that person drove a paradigm shift, but she did.
Well, speaking of Silent Spring, I got this from the library. I think I may read it. I read the first couple chapters, and because I've been reading other books about her. but she has a wonderful writing style. It just draws you. We saw the little clip there, and they did the narration, and you're just sort of like, yes, you know. So she brought it to our attention, and well, the chemical companies didn't like it, but President Kennedy had his task, write the special report. She felt some vindication, and I think about her. She passed away, and that was very sad. But she went on to, that was, like we mentioned at the beginning, a catalyst for the growing environmental movement that came about in the 1960s. We have this example with chemicals, and then they started to apply it to so many other things. Like, oh wait, there's some other things that we're doing.
What I thought was important too, kind of came out of that documentary, the importance of the freedom of the press, because someone can write a book like that, and if it's not publicized and you don't have news media, especially a subject like that, it could have just been kind of swept under the rug. So the freedom of the press is so important. Now, it's really important to make sure that's not being, pushed down because it's not the narrative that either corporations want or the government wants. So that's an important point in that documentary, I think.
So you're not a book banner, are you? No, you're absolutely right.
And what's kind of a shame, a lot of news media is profit driven. So the voice of certain news agencies can kind of be drowned out because they don't have the money to continue the message. So I think it's important to have the points of view that come out to the public. So.
Yeah, and with this age where social media and AIs, we talked about before, where you don't know if you're talking to an actual person or not. The one good thing about this time is that you have to be more discriminating about the resources that you're seeking, but compared to the time where she was writing this, we have an unbelievable amount of information and potential to get information, scientific and otherwise. So hopefully that will help keep, no matter what is going on with, say, corporations or particular governments, that as citizen scientists, that we as people can learn more, make connections, share that information, and continue on with the type of work that she's done, in whatever way, whether it's biology, science,
What worries me now, though, is she had the chemical companies come after her, and they wrote articles and so forth. But now you take, that was about pesticides and DDT. Now we have climate change due to the burning of fossil fuels, and it's hard to get the scientists are telling us this is what's happening. If you burn fossil fuels, you put more CO2 into the atmosphere, and you're just heating up the planet, and we're going to see all these but you just see the fierce opposition that comes from the industry to try to prevent that message or try to put a lot of misinformation out there. So then there wasn't that, or there was to a degree, but nothing like we're seeing nowadays, So we have to contend with that,
Right.
What are your thoughts?
I just, I think it's amazing that when you watch, say, the documentary from start to finish, and right from the beginning when she was proposing, when the pesticides were coming out, that they should do more testing, there could be dangers later on, we should look into this further, it might not be safe. I mean, she was putting the word out, not saying, like, don't do this, ban this. Like, it did have some good things it was doing, but she was kind of pushing the envelope, like, we really need to be very careful with this. And then right till the end, what she was trying to prove in the beginning was actually, like, at the end, now everyone was now looking at it and saying, well, she's right, this is correct, you know what I'm saying? Everything we're reading or things that she's saying, she was right all along, but it took how many years before anyone would stop kind of sweeping it under the carpet, and they would actually listen to it and start looking into it. So it took a good number of her life, but she was able to do it. She stuck with it, and she never quit, and she never gave up. And
there was that race towards the end when she knew she was dying.
Yep.
And she knew she had to finish that book to get the word out.
Yeah.
Powerful. Well, I'm glad you guys were here today to discuss it. I learned a lot. I had heard of the book and I had heard of Rachel Carson, but it was just on the fringes, and I was like, oh yeah, but this was really good. It made me read more books about it. Speaking of which, they have a lovely children's book out there. It's Rachel Carson and her book that changed the world. I actually love this book. I might actually get it. The illustrations are beautiful, and of course there are lots of biographies at your local public library on Rachel Carson. So libraries are great places. We record this at our local public library, and they're fantastic. So, but thank you guys for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jeff.
And,
Thank you.
Thank you for watching, and cheers. I even wrote down dichloral, diphenyl,
Oh yeah, that's what that stands for.
I was just like dichloral. I was actually
I would have to break it down by like 3 letters at a time, because I would be like so.
Thank goodness you're able to shorten these things with just letters.
I know, because when they said it on the show, and I'm like, I was like, if I tried to say that once, I would just murder that. So
Yeah, I was wondering if that was something Jeff was going to say in his cold open,
Yeah.
and he had to memorize.
We'd still be doing it. Take 70. Damn it.
Well, did you ever see that Monty Python skit about being poor? And one guy said, I was, we're very poor. And he'd say something about how, he goes, poor? That was pure luxury. I used to live in a cardboard box.